the University of Vermont. Welcome to the first event in our two-day Festival of Tibet, a festival which celebrates the culture of Tibet. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to make a couple announcements, and particularly to thank the people who have put in a number of hours in bringing about this festival. First of all, Kate Weaver, who is the office manager of our Asian Studies program. Where's Kate? There's Kate. Kate really carried the burden of the arrangements for this and did a super job. And I'll just name the others quickly. Colin Dodson, I think many of you saw the rather spectacular poster that we had. That was Colin's work. Jan Reynolds, who will show a film tomorrow, excuse me, who has been to Tibet a number of times, skied around Mount Everest, if you can believe it, all the way around, and is an extraordinary photographer as well as an adventurer. Penny Holden, who was really the main inspiration for this whole event, and a yoga master, my yoga teacher. Paul Heald, who is, I think many of you know Paul. He's in real estate here and has been active throughout in organizing this. Jim Kelly, who is head of the Tibetan Resettlement organization, and is married one of the people who resettled, I think. He's married a Tibetan woman. Jim Hagan, who set up a similar program at Castleton State and is a good friend of Robert Thurman and Shelley Hagan, who's in the art department here. Also a great enthusiast for Tibetan culture. And most important, members of the Tibet Association of Vermont, who are really the people who put this together. Pasang Tonduk, who's the president, Tenzing Lakang, Tenzing Wasser Dondup, and Pasang Dondup. That is the committee. So what you'll see in the next couple days, tonight and tomorrow, is the work of this committee. Let me quickly just announce the events tomorrow. In the Southwark Ballroom, I hope you know where it is. It's over on the Redstone campus next to the music building. It's on the second floor of the Southwick building on the Redstone campus. At 11:30, there will be a film, Cultural Adventure, a film by Jan Reynolds. It's mainly a film for kids, but it's a fascinating film for everyone. It's a journey by yak on an ancient trade route, crossing a 20,000-foot pass in the Himalayas. Beautiful. I haven't seen this film, but I've seen Jan's work, and I think it'll be spectacular. Then from 12:30 to 2, a crafts fair and Tibetan food. There will be Tibetan specialties, which will be for sale, and a crafts fair. Then from 2 to 3, there will be a performance of Tibetan song and dance, which will be performed by the local Tibetan community, which I think you'll enjoy enormously. And then from 3 to 4:30, again, food and crafts. And throughout, there will be a display of thangkas, Tibetan religious paintings, prayer flags, and so on. It promises to be a very colorful scene. I think many of you have read the books of Dr. Robert Thurman and know that he is probably the foremost specialist, scholar on Tibetan Buddhism in the United States. He's the J. Tsong Kampa Professor of Indo-Tibetan Buddhist Studies at Columbia University. And this is the first endowed chair in this field in the United States. He's a prolific writer and translator, as you know. His publications include Tsung Kapa's Speech of Gold, Reason and Enlightenment in the Central Philosophy of Tibet, the translator of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a book entitled Essential Tibetan Buddhism, and most recently, Inner Revolution, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Real Happiness, among a number of other books. Dr. Thurman is a close personal friend of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. In fact, just last week he was in Austria at a 10-day seminar with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama ordained Dr. Thurman as a Tibetan Buddhist monk, and he's the first Westerner to have been so ordained. And he gave him the name Tenzing, which means upholder of the faith. There's probably no one more qualified to deliver the presentation, which he's going to deliver tonight, and I think that the topic is extremely timely, and I'm sure that will become obvious in Professor Thurman's presentation. The title of the speech, The Dalai Lama's Millennial Ethic of Intelligent Nonviolence, Sources in Tibetan Buddhism and Prospects for Our Troubled World. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Thurman.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm very happy to be here and happy to see all of you happy Vermont faces. I was flying up here yesterday, and then since then, Jim Hagan has very kindly driven me down to Rutland and back and forth, Killington and hither and thither. Just having come from Austria, I'm probably somewhat confused as to where I am, but I thought that I do think that Vermont is sort of like the Shire, but I haven't yet seen a Vermonter with furry feet. But maybe some of you can show me. But I mean it in a certain other way, in that I think Vermont is a state that has still a kind of rural reality, a connection to the land, and it seems to me from what you've done politically lately that you're more sane than most of the other American states. And my main mission here, one of my missions here tonight is of course I love Tibet and the Dalai Lama and all that, but I also am very much hoping you're going to return Senator Jeffords to the Congress, because if he did such a brave thing and he saved us from a lot of trouble the last year or two, and I certainly hope you all will vote for him. I really do. He should be rewarded. I'm sure that the other side is spending a lot of money trying to get rid of him for his disloyalty to the loony patrol. But I think it's very valuable what he did, and very brave, actually, to be an independent, and I hope you will support him. And I am getting no kickback from his campaign. He doesn't even know me. But, so anyway, tonight I was just very happy. I'm very happy anyway, because I spent 10 days with the Dalai Lama, and he was teaching the Kalachakra Tantra. And in the teaching of that, he teaches also a whole bunch of preparatory things and basic Mahayana teachings, Mahayana Buddhist teachings, and other things. And he was so brilliant, it was wonderful. And so many of you know probably who are here who have managed to find this room. You therefore know that, you probably know a lot about the Dalai Lama already, and you know that he was quite ill earlier in the year. In fact, the whole Tibetan community was very much afraid and worried. And we were very sad because we had his visit in New York. He was going to teach for 4 days in Radio City Music Hall, which would have been really nice, and he will, and I think in the future. And but he is totally healthy and totally zooming with energy, and he gave the most brilliant teaching. It was a real privilege to be at it. It was extraordinary. From A to Z, it was just incredible. 10 days of amazing, and so just being in his presence is just such a pleasure. I'm just floating on it still. So it's nice to come to Vermont in that sort of atmosphere. Because, the Kala Chakra, I don't know how any of you know about the Kala Chakra. Kala Chakra means the wheel of time. So the time, I don't know, what's with my glasses? The time machine, like a time machine, but it is a different vision of time than you think. When we think of time machine, we think of H.G. Wells or Doctor Who flies in a TARDIS through time, as if time were a sort of medium, like a river or a lake or something that you can move through, sort of reifying it into an objective thing, time. And whereas the Kala Chakra doesn't mean time machine in that sense, the Kala Chakra, or wheel of time, means that time itself is a machine. History itself is a machine. It's a vision of Buddha that is really the most divine vision of Buddha that exists in Buddhism, probably. I mean, it's the same as the Buddha of the Pure Lands, Mahayana Buddhism, where Buddha is really almost more powerful and more important than any god, and has powers of shaping the world, and the compassion of the Buddha, the love of the Buddha for living beings, is such that it shapes the world for the betterment of living beings. It makes the world into a cradle, a crucible for the evolution of living beings from a state of suffering and a state of alienation and lostness into a state of freedom and a state of happiness and joyfulness. And the Buddha's compassion is considered by Buddhists to be that powerful that, while we think the reality is imperfect and I'm stumbling over this and I'm missing that and this went wrong and that's a tragedy and we're suffering all the time, enlightened being like a Buddha, the way the Buddhist vision of a Buddha, I mean, I wouldn't really quite know even if I met one, but the Buddhist vision of a Buddha is of a being that is completely capable of responding to the needs of all beings and completely assuring them in a very divine type of way. And so therefore the Kala Chakra gets into what I call in religious studies, it gets into the Buddhists' Buddhadacy problem. You're familiar with the theodicy problem in religious studies, which is, of course, the problem in a monotheistic religious tradition where the world is believed to have been created by an all-powerful deity, all-powerful and all-compassionate. What happened? The mic is too loud? Well, the other mic is not working. Whoops. Oh, you're turning off the other one. Thanks. Okay, thank you. And that's wonderful. And the Buddha's all-powerful, but somebody needs to unplug the microphone. That's good. And the monotheists have a hard time with the theodicy problem, because the theodicy problem arises from the problem of suffering and death and evil. If you have an omnipotent being who is also all-compassionate, where does the evil come from, and the death and the imperfection and the suffering? Why would an omnipotent and omnicompassionate being, create a world in which people suffer? If they could create it any way they wanted, then that means they're a little sadistic or something, or they have an odd sense of humor or something. But the Buddhists sneak out of that one slightly by not claiming that the Buddha ever created it, and also they actually get God out of it too. There's a famous event in Buddhism I wanted to tell for one lady I met earlier in the day, and I think I'll start by telling it, although it wasn't in my plan, but I will. There's a famous story, I think it's the Kevada Sutta in Pali, where the Buddha tells of a time in his former life when he was a sage seeking the truth, and he wanted to know the nature of reality, which is what the Buddhist quest is, not just belief in something, but knowing what is real and what is unreal. And so in that light, in his former life when he was a bodhisattva, Buddha was a great sage, and he had yogic powers. He could travel in the heavens and so forth. He could talk to the angels and the gods and even go see the demons. So he said, well, there's a creator, Brahma, who created the world, I hear. So if I want to know what is real, I should go ask the one who created it. So I'm going to go ask God what's real. So he goes to heaven in his astral body, and he meets Brahma in heaven. And he says, oh, great Brahma, I heard you created the world. And therefore you should be able to answer my question, which is, what was there before there was earth, water, fire, air, space, and consciousness? And Brahma said, excuse me, who do you think I am? Who do you think you are? I'm God, you know. I'm busy. I don't have time for this kind of question. Why are you asking me this nonsense? And he brushed him off, in other words. God just blew him off. So Buddha was a polite bodhisattva. He said, well, I'm sorry, God, to trouble you with such a paltry question. But I just thought you'd know, and I'm seeking truth and reality, and I thought you could tell me. So then, excuse me, I'll leave. So Buddha's leaving. The bodhisattva, rather, is leaving heaven. And then, as he's just going out of this heaven, Brahma heaven, where the Creator God lives, in this Indian version, he hears suddenly from the corner, like, hey, come over here. And there's Brahma, there's God. And God wants him to come. God sneaked off his throne, and he creeped around, and he's over there in the hallway, in the vestibule of heaven. He says, come over here, come here, come here. So then Buddha goes over, Bodhisattva goes over, and he says, oh, I'm sorry, God, please don't be mad at me. So then Brahma says, look, I can't turn away a sincere seeker of truth by just brushing you off like that. But I had to do that because the other gods would have been nervous if they heard what I'm about to tell you. And he said, actually, the thing is, you see, I don't know the answer. You see, I didn't really create all of this. I really don't know what's going on. What happened is that, I suddenly was here all alone in the universe. Poof, here I was. And I was the only being in this universe, the newly, emerged Big Bang sort of universe, and I'm here. And I was wondering what's going on and where was everybody? Where's the party type of thing. And then suddenly, while I was thinking that, all these other gods showed up, the angels and the gods, like by apparition, poof, 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 they all like there, like in the Matrix, they suddenly appeared, And so then they saw me and they said, Dada, creator, So then I said, I'm not your creator, give me a break. What is going on? And then they got all very nervous and looked frightened. So then I said, okay, I'm the creator, everything's cool. And then they said, oh, phew, and that's nice. And ever since then, they've been worshiping me. And they feel happy and secure around me because they think I created it. So since I didn't want to tell them, they would really have identity crisis. So I'm sorry I can't answer your question. But I know that you are going to be a Buddha, I can tell, because I am God, I know a lot. And you're going to become a Buddha sooner or later. You keep seeking the truth like this, and you'll be a Buddha. And then you will know what is the nature of reality. And then when you know, I'm going to come and help you teach beings. Because, beings think I created it. And when everything is fine and everything goes nice, and there's a decent president in the White House, etc., then they worship me and they say, oh, thanks, oh great God, it's wonderful. And then when things go wrong and somebody dies and they lose a loved one and things are terrible and there's a loony in the White House, they come and they get really mad at me. And I don't like all that negative charisma. So when you find out what happens and what the world is really like, tell all the living beings that it's not my fault. They have their own karma. We are here together. We are working it out. And I'm doing my best. So then it is true that when the Buddha did attain enlightenment in later life, that the god Brahma, the great god Brahma, came down and brought him the Dharma chakra. It's called the wheel of Dharma, to turn the wheel of Dharma. And actually Buddha was acting coy in that life. He had to ask him 3 times. And then he showed him a vision, because the Buddha was saying, I can't, I know what's going on now and I'm cool, but people are not going to listen to me, so why should I waste my time and bother them? And then Brahma made a vision where he saw all these lotuses and different kinds of flowers in a huge garden. And then it rained on them, and then the different flowers bloomed and blossomed in different ways. And so he said, and so Buddha got the point. He said, okay, different ones will learn different things from the way I teach, but I'll be like the rain that will fall on them. So then Brahma said, good, you go tell them. But anyway, that's a story. Isn't that a cute story? That's amazing. You have to realize that 25 or 27 or whenever many 100 years ago, in a country that did believe in God, and that had a lot of priests and a lot of, rituals and many things, someone could get away with telling a story like that, and kind of, being kind of humorous and yet profound in a way about the nature of the divine. So the Buddhists, in that way, they don't take responsibility for creating things. We all create this world together. You have your own karma. Buddhists have been evolutionary, had an evolutionary vision of life for thousands of years. It didn't take a bearded Englishman, going to the Galapagos and watching some turtles to let them figure out that they were interconnected with the other animals. They've known that for thousands of years. And in fact, their sense of being embedded in evolution, which we consider something so modern and post-Darwinian, has been with them for thousands of years, and it's much more powerful than our sense of it. Because after all, we don't think that we were really connected with all the other life forms like the monkeys and this, that we think our genes were, you know. The genes came hopping to us out from the monkeys and from the whatever it was, you know. But it wasn't, we weren't personally around, you know. Since we only exist in this life, we think we materialists, you know. We're just our brain, you know. And so genes hopped along and they made up our brain, you know, and we weren't personally involved in evolution. But the Buddhist thinks they were. They personally were turtles, and we personally were crocodiles, and we personally were lions and tigers and different things. And somehow we like evolved and evolved and evolved. And believe it or not, we got to be humans. Not only that, but you lucky ones got to be hobbits in the land of Vermont, in the Shire. Unlike I have a lesser good karma, I have to live in New York where we get bombed by terrorists. Although I love New York, I must admit. But okay, so I want to begin by reading something from the Dalai Lama in the context, because tonight we're talking about his millennial ethic of intelligent nonviolence, and we want to talk about really the book that if I had a book to dish out, which I don't, but I mean you can find it. It's the Dalai Lama's book called Ethics for the New Millennium. Many of you may know it, but many may not. I think it's quite a marvelous book. And in it, the Dalai Lama really takes the kind of stance of sort of asking people of the world for something to change the ways in which we're managing the world, and to cease from the sort of destructive way we're managing it and try to manage it in a harmonious and positive way. And it's a wonderful book. And in order to sort of help you into that theme of the Dalai Lama's ethic, I think I have first I want to read something the Dalai Lama recently said in a speech to the European Parliament in Strasbourg. And then I have to go back, I think, and sort of talk a little bit about Tibetan Buddhism, although I don't know, maybe all of you are already enlightened, I'm not sure.
We all know.
What? You what? You are? Yeah? Everything's... You all know about Tibetan Buddhism. So you know what is Tibetan Buddhism. Oh, you do? Okay, then I can skip that part. And then, what? I can skip that part. Oh, that's good. Does everyone know enough about Tibetan Buddhism that I can skip the Tibetan Buddhism part? Oh, dear. Well, I'll have to leave, and you live here, so they should sign up to study with you, I think, in the future. They really should. What's your name? Amanda. So Amanda can help you out if there are any loose questions trailing after I leave. And Amanda, you'll be patient. Since you know about Tibetan Buddhism, you're very patient, and you'll be patient if I repeat some of the things that you know. So then I'm going to detour back about Tibetan Buddhism, and I'm going to try to put it in the context of how it is that there is such a person as the Dalai Lama on the planet today, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate from the West, but considered a kind of reincarnation of an archangel in Tibet, and even more in other Asian countries, it seems, as well, and who is sort of a kind of world leader without portfolio, let us say, a world leader without country, a world leader who people with country would do well to be listening to, which I'm afraid they are not listening to. Although they meet him and they talk to him, they like to invite him for tea, they like his good vibes, but then they don't really follow what he has to say, so far. But he still keeps talking, he doesn't give up. So I'm going to go back to how that happened, in other words, sort of historically and philosophically, back into Buddhism. And then to give about how that relates to what we would call a Buddhist ethic. And what is Buddhist ethics? I discovered 30 years ago when I began to teach that in the Western Academy, there were some people who thought that Buddhism had no ethics. That Buddhism, not that they were unethical, but just that they didn't do ethics because Buddhists were just trying to get out of the world and get into nirvana, which they thought was somewhere else. And so therefore, why worry about ethics in this world? You follow me? That was the prevailing academic view. They thought that ethics involved being sort of Western individualists, and ethics was something Western. and when I realized that they had that problem, I began studying Buddhist ethics and trying to explain how it was very ethical. So I will do that a little bit, and then finally I'll come to a little bit summarize some of his main points of his book in conclusion. Those 4 things I'm going to try to do anyway tonight. I already wasted a lot of time with some stories, but I will work on that. So beginning with the Dalai Lama, he says, in the context, and this was after 9/11, this was shortly after 9/11, and it was in Europe, to the European Parliament in Strasbourg. So he said, I mean, many other things, but I'm going to read a few passages. He said, in the context of our newly emerging global community, all forms of violence, including war, are totally inappropriate means of settling disputes. Violence and war have always been part of human history, and in ancient times there were winners and losers. However, there would be no winners at all if another global conflict were to occur today. We must therefore have the courage and vision to call for a world without nuclear weapons and even national armies in the long run. Especially in the light of the terrible attacks in the United States, the international community must make a sincere attempt to use the horrible and shocking experience to develop a sense of global responsibility where a culture of dialogue and nonviolence is used in resolving differences. Dialogue is the only sensible and intelligent way of resolving differences and clashes of interests, whether between individuals or nations. The promotion of a culture of dialogue and nonviolence for the future of mankind is a compelling task of the international community. It is not enough for governments to endorse the principle of nonviolence without any appropriate action to support and promote it. If nonviolence is to prevail, nonviolent movements must be made effective and successful. Some consider the 20th century a century of war and bloodshed. I believe the challenge before us is to make the new century one of dialogue and nonviolence. Furthermore, in dealing with conflicts, too often we lack the proper judgment and courage. We fail to pay adequate attention to situations of potential conflict when they are at an early stage of development. Once all the circumstances have progressed to a state where the emotions of the people or communities involved in disputes have become fully charged, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to prevent a dangerous situation from exploding. We see this tragic situation repeated time and again. So we must learn to detect early signs of conflict and have the courage to address the problem before it reaches the boiling point. I remain convinced that most human conflicts can be solved through genuine dialogue conducted with the spirit of openness and reconciliation. I have therefore consistently sought a resolution of the issue of Tibet through nonviolence and dialogue. And so on. He goes on then about dealing with the Chinese and everything, which I don't want to go into. I just wanted to read that basic thing. Around that same time, he wrote a letter to George W. Bush, saying that he was very, very sorry about the tragic thing that had happened, and he sent kind of condolences type of thing. And then he said that, of course, he was sure that the president would realize that more violence is not the way to react to violence, and that violence does not put an end to violence, sort of an ancient teaching. And then he said, and I'm sure that the president will make a wise decision where I have to admire his faith. And maybe eventually that could be the case. We have to remain open-minded after all. There's in dialogue has to be, even with like members of the Skull and Bones. We have to try to have dialogue. So now the question before us is, when the Dalai Lama gives a speech like that, or when he maintains this point of view, which he does regularly, is this just some sort of completely pie-in-the-sky sort of thing? Why is he saying that this is correct? Well, he gives his own reason in that passage. He says, in the past there were winners and losers in war, but in the present and in the future there can be no winners and losers. No one can win, in other words, anymore. And I think that's one very powerful reason. It isn't only that violence and war are immoral or unethical. It is that violence and war are ineffective, is actually his reason. This is the marvelous and amazing thing about his view, is that his call for ethics is that the ethical thing and the effective thing are the same. I think you will recognize that we often think that the ethical thing and the effective thing are two different things. And the Kantian idea, we sort of do the absolutely right thing according to categorical imperative or something. from a sort of intellectual perspective of what we would always think should be done in such a circumstance, and whether or not it's effective, it's our duty to do so. It's our absolute duty to do so. Whereas in the Dalai Lama's view, and from the Buddhist tradition, in fact, what is ethical and what is effective is always the same, ultimately the same. And this is what he means. He means that the world now is such that, and we see that. I mean, in the case where they fly an airplane into the World Trade Center, where they shoot people just randomly in the suburbs of the nation's capital, because they've gone a little bit crazy or something. You know, $400 billion or $350 billion war budget, and huge weapons of mass destruction, and immense police forces and things like that, still don't protect people against that. I mean, maybe they now have caught this one person, but now that it's had a big media play, we hate to think about how many other slightly demented people are thinking about how they're going to do it. And you know, there are plenty of very disgruntled and alienated terrorists who are thinking how to go one better on you know, a mere couple of glass buildings here and there, festering in various terrible alienated situations around the planet that we are leaving untended, in fact. And any amount of missile defenses and like vast, complicated, technological, expensive things are going to not protect us from that, clearly. And so in that sense, we can crush someone. And we can bomb into a country into obliteration with the supposedly most powerful machinery of war that ever existed on Earth. But that still is powerless to actually stop individuals from using weapons of mass destruction against us, since they are not nations and they are not necessarily targeted when we just bomb all sorts of innocent people. And by bombing all sorts of innocent people in some mass civilian bombing campaigns, we create that many more people who wish revenge against us and that much more hatred against us. So therefore, this old-fashioned method of marching out to fight a nation is simply insane in the current situation. The Dalai Lama is not just talking pie in the sky, he is being practical. But okay, before we come to that, we'll come back to that, let me go in the background. How does this come about that from this tradition, which we think of in the West as being a sort of quietist, withdraw from the world, you know, attain nirvana and forget about the world, it's just misery anyway, tradition, which is our false view of what Buddhism is. So we have to go back to basic Buddhism and then the history of India and Tibet in a real quick flash nutshell. If Amanda will be patient with me. Thank you. And okay, now let's do a little Buddhism. Buddha was a prince who was bred and trained to be a warrior, actually, a general. He was like the Dalia of his day and his country. And he was partying up a storm from age 1 to age 29 because his father had a prediction that if he becomes too pensive and thoughtful and encounters suffering in his early life, he will become pensive and thoughtful, he'll go off, he'll become a Buddha. And the father, being a king and a general, he thought being a Buddha was something boring. He didn't know that that would be of any use at all. And so rather, he wanted him to become a king and a world conqueror, which it was predicted he would be a very great king. And so he surrounded him with pleasure as much as possible all his youthful life. And so he was, you know, he was just like some yuppie in Houston running around, getting his father to like give him an A when he deserved an F in college and all that kind of thing. So he was just like that. But then he switched around because he did see a sick person, an old person, a dying person, a dead person, and he saw a truth seeker, and he realized there might be something more to life than just being a general, you know, and just a round of pleasures. So he went out to seek the nature of reality. Then he discovered the nature of reality. He tried some religious methods, some meditations, and found them wanting. He found some high trance states, but he didn't think they were the final truth. And so he bent himself on just looking into himself, looking into the world, and trying to find out what his true nature is. And of course, since in his previous life he'd talked to God and he'd done all these other things, he was already well poised at the moment close to that, which actually, in the Buddhist view, every human being is relatively close to discovering the nature of reality. It really isn't that difficult to know what is real and what is unreal. Human beings actually are gifted with the ability to know that in the Buddhist view. But I'm jumping ahead. So then he did that, and then one day he finally said, wow, eureka, now I know. He said, I'm awake, I woke up. He just said that. And nobody was listening, except God. God was going, yay. You know. But he knew everything. And this is a very strange claim. He didn't, like religious prophets, he didn't meet God and have God tell him, go out, my son, and preach and tell people to believe and that I'll save them. Because already in a previous life, God had told him he couldn't save them. He didn't know what to do himself, in fact. And he needed, maybe they needed to save themselves. So he didn't do that. It isn't like a religious thing. He actually had a kind of amazing experience where he felt that he knew everything. And he understood everything. He knew how every cell in his body worked, how every atom in his body worked, how all his subatomic energies worked, how the past and the present and the future of himself and all beings. He had this kind of amazing vision. In a way, you could say he became all of that. It's a very strange thing, Buddhahood. It's like you going around being yourself inside your skin all your time before that. When you become a Buddha, you suddenly become everything. And you sort of know it all by being it all, if you know what I mean, in a different way. You know it all by being one with it all. And yet, you don't just sort of melt into soup like some sort of Vaseline glop. You know all of it by being all of it, and yet you're aware also of the differentiations that are there. Buddhahood is wrongly thought of by people as some sort of simplistic state, where, because of course, we are all having a hard time in life, and after 12 hours of being awake, for example, we want nothing better than to pass out and to just collapse and have no awareness at all of anything. Deep sleep is something deeply to be desired by us after a mere 12 hours of like worrying about the world, because the way we experience the world is strenuous, And so we imagine somehow maybe enlightenment is going to be a really deep sleep, where you're just in bliss forever and never wake up. And something simple like that, like the absolute must be like absolute, like boing, just out. And therefore, it's so hard to imagine that enlightenment, in fact, would be a much higher tolerance of ambiguity, of complexity, of contradiction, of non-duality than we normally are capable of. But that is, in fact, the case. Enlightenment is a far more complicated state than a state of ordinary, sleepwalking, individuated human existence. Well, anyway, so the Buddha said, and then this is what I'm forever grateful. He understood everything, he said, and then he smiled. I'm so happy. You could understand everything, and you could say, oy vey. Oh, no. Is that how it is? What a mess. And just split type of thing, or just go and get drunk or whatever. That could be what reality would be. It would be just so unpleasant type of thing. But he smiles instead. Why? Because he feels really good. Because he finds true happiness. And more than that, because his finding of true happiness is not apart from all other beings. He sees that all other beings can find true happiness too. Because how could you find true happiness if you discover that you're interconnected with all beings if they're all miserable? You'd have to have some sort of super anesthesia to do that, you see. So this was his good. So Buddhism is totally misunderstood by people who think, because they hear the noble truth of suffering as the first noble truth, and they think, like the poor Pope got really worried about it in his Threshold of Hope, and he wrote in there that how could anybody adopt such a pessimistic religion as Buddhism? I can't understand it. It must be because they're not Italians or Polish and they don't have good pasta or whatever. And they live in Asia somewhere. Never mind, the Asians invented pasta, but never mind. And how can they be so depressed, So that's a widespread misunderstanding of Buddhism, that it's all misery, But that wasn't the Buddha's understanding. Why was Buddhism popular in Asia? And why is it popular everywhere? Because Buddha is the guy who insists that people can and will be completely happy. That's what life is about, is seeking happiness, and full happiness can be achieved. Evolution has an aim, and it is an aim of full happiness. Now, one can live in evolution without taking such an aim, and just wander up and down and stay in misery, and have one kind of misery after another. Certainly, for an endless period of time, one is free to do that. But any sensible person who realizes that they like being happy and they don't like to suffer, if they get the notion that it's possible to be really, truly, reliably, and securely, and really happy, they, of course, will make that their evolutionary aim. So that was the Buddha's news. The Buddha's news is not the first noble truth. It's the third noble truth. Freedom from suffering is the third. The cessation of suffering is the third noble truth. That was what it was all about. As the Dalai Lama said, if the Buddha only had the first noble truth, which is that the unenlightened life is suffering, basically his whole teaching would have been nothing but like, nya, nya, you know. You're caught in suffering, can't get out, nya, nya, that's it. That would be the Buddha's contribution, big deal. You don't tell someone they're in a prison unless you have a way out for them, is the point. So first he discovered there can be freedom from suffering by awakening from the cause of suffering. And then he said, well, now, if you insist on being unawake, if you remain unenlightened, then you will suffer. And that's not even as pessimistic as Socrates. Remember what he said? He said the unexamined life is not worth living. But Buddha didn't say the unenlightened life is not worth living. He just said it's going to be frustrating. You're going to have a hard time. You'll never have satisfaction. It's just really like the Rolling Stones. There's nothing, no big mystery. You know, can't get no satisfaction. That's the first noble truth. If you remain unenlightened now, why do you suffer? Is the second noble truth, the cause. And Buddha's great claim to fame, the great verse in Buddhism is Om ye dharma hetu prabhava hetun tesham tathagata hyavadat tesham chayo nirodo evam vadi mahashramaniye swaha. I'm sorry, I just love to say that verse. It means, I know you love it too, I know. It means that it's in a summary of the Buddha's teaching given by one of his disciples to another person who wanted to meet, who thought maybe Buddha would be worth meeting, which is the Buddha is the one who says that all things arise from causes. What are those causes, and what is the way of preventing those causes or interfering with those causes? That is the Buddha's teaching. That's the Buddha's philosophy. And that's a very strange thing. That's like a scientific thing to be celebrated for discovering causation. But what does it mean? It means that, you see, if you think you're suffering because some all-powerful being wants you to suffer, because of you're helpless about this and that, there's nothing you can do about it, then you're completely helpless. But if you think that your suffering has a cause, you can analyze it, understand it, then you could perhaps change that cause, interfere with that cause, and then you can thereby free yourself from suffering. Just like you have a cold, you know, you realize you got a bug, then you go, you know, you take some Chinese herbs, actually, since the great modern West didn't develop the cure for the common cold yet. So in fact, you take some Chinese herbs or some Tibetan herbs or some foul-tasting Ayurvedic potion, and then you're better. But in between, of course, if you have to give a lecture, you take Tylenol cold. So we don't knock modernity entirely. So the point is, if you know the cause, you can do something. Now, what is the cause of our suffering? It's not mysterious at all. You can all understand it. I want you, in addition to Amanda, I want everyone else to completely understand in the simplest way what Buddhism is tonight. Don't ever tell anybody you don't know what it is, some mysterious thing, okay? Then I'll feel I did my job here. Why? What is the cause? The cause is called ignorance often, but that is not correct, because ignorance is sort of like something you don't know. But the cause of your suffering, my suffering, and those of you enlightened, just never mind if I use the general you. The cause of your suffering is what you know, not what you don't know. Because what you know is misknown. You wrongly know something. And what do you wrongly know? Everyone here, what do they wrongly know? Well, what do I wrongly know? I'll just take it myself. Well, I know I'm Bob Thurman. And not only that, not just that I'm Bob Thurman. You know, I can whip out my driver's license and everything. I know I'm really Bob Thurman. And there's a real Bob Thurmanity in there. And that's an absolute thing. And I know that. And so when I hear about Descartes, I think, oh, he's really smart. You know, I even doubt that I exist as Bob Thurman, and that therefore I know I'm Bob Thurman. Really genius thing. If he had run into a Zen master, if some Zen master had been over doing wine tasting in Belgium in those days, he would have given him such a whack. I can't doubt that I'm doubting. Doubt more! Of course you can doubt that you're doubting. Give us a break. You'll never wake up out of the matrix if you don't doubt that you're doubting. It's like Descartes couldn't find himself. So then that himself being there was the one thing he was sure of. Wait a minute, I can't find an elephant in here. Okay, we're all sure there's an elephant in here. That's really smart. That's modernity, Western modernity. It's really bright stuff. I hope there's some people here from the Department of Philosophy. So So the point is, you all know that you're here and you know you're really you. Like Amanda knows she's really Amanda. And she knows about Tibetan Buddhism. And that's correct, but that she's Amanda, that's not correct. And for example, doesn't it make you uneasy that you know you're really you? Yes, it does. Why do you think you feel so anxious all the time? Because you know what? Nobody else thinks so. Not a single other, well, maybe when someone was in love with you for a short time, they thought you were really you. Your mother and your father, and maybe your beloved, they thought, oh, you're really you. But otherwise, they don't think you're really you. They think they're really them. And they're nervous because they know that you don't agree with that. So here we are, war of all against all. Now, usually it's not war. It's like, oh, come in, sit down, have a chair. Let's have a lecture on Buddhism. It's nice. Because we're all well-fed. You live in Vermont. You have furry feet. Everything is fine. They didn't start the Homeland Security on top of your head here yet. So you're happy, but let it start getting like, let it start getting like a bad economy. Let's have a big depression. Let's start starving. Let's start having a fire alarm. Let's have terrorists. And suddenly, everyone's out for themselves. And nobody else is helping you. So you think you're the real thing, in short, right? You do. That's why people like The Matrix, because they all identify with Neo, with what's his name? Keanu, my favorite. He was Buddha before that. I think it's so perfect. Remember, he was Buddha, in Little Buddha. Then he's in The Matrix. Then, who's the one, I'm the one. But my old teacher, my old Mongolian teacher used to say, everybody goes around all the time secretly thinking, I'm the one. Don't you? Come on. You do. And then you stop to think, and they are thinking that about themselves. Now, when you think you're the one, the real one, is the world ever going to satisfy you in giving you enough agreement? I don't think so. Are they going to pay enough attention to you? Are they going to think you're as important as you think? No, they think they're more important. Therefore, they're going to come and take your stuff. They're going to come and put you in their agenda. And then you have to put them in your agenda. And you have to battle with them. And life is a struggle. And are you winning a struggle with you versus the universe? You're the one. The universe thinks it's more of them. You're going to win? I don't think so. Even your president of the U.S., and even you go to Yale, you're not going to win. And therefore, you're going to suffer. Even the height of success, you become a star, you become this and that, it falls. You'll grow old. You'll grow ugly. You'll start being decrepit. You won't remember your name. I'm getting like that. My hero is Admiral Stockwell. Some of you older people will remember. Where am I? What am I doing here? That's the greatest statement ever made in American politics. The most honest one. All these fake people pretending they know what's going on. So the point is, that's all the Buddha said. It's something obvious to all of us. You think you're it, the world doesn't, you lose in that struggle. That's the truth of suffering. And the cause of it is thinking you're it. Now, he investigated that. He thought he was Siddhartha, the prince. He thought he was Siddhartha, the one seeking enlightenment, he thought. He thought he was going to have a big enlightenment, maybe, he thought. And what did he discover? Now some people wrongly understand Buddhism. They think that the cure for that thinking, I'm the one, is to have an experience that I don't exist. Someone was telling me today, because Buddha always constantly talked about selflessness. He considered, they say, the lion's roar of the teaching of Buddhism is the teaching of identitylessness or selflessness. They call it like a lion's roar because it's the most powerful expression in reality, in philosophy. Selflessness. No one can defeat that expression. But he also taught self. He didn't just teach selflessness. But what selflessness means is that absolute self that you feel is there, that's the real you, doesn't exist. But when you discover that doesn't exist, you haven't changed yourself. It never did exist, was the point. Your relative self exists, and when the relative self is free of the strain of having to be an absolute self, amazingly enough, it becomes happy. Suddenly, you're not against the rest of the world because you're related to the world. You're relational to the world. So like when someone else has something good happen to them, when someone else gets happy, you don't feel jealous and threatened. How are you when someone's really happy? You're like, oh great, they're happy. Oh yeah. Why aren't I happy? Like, I should be happy. Why are they being happy? But you don't say that. You say, oh, it's so nice you're happy. What did they take? You know, what's the matter with them? Have they gone crazy? Because you get jealous right away. Because their happiness threatens you. Like, maybe something's wrong with me. I'm not happy. But if you're connected to them, when you're related to them, their happiness is your happiness. At least they're not grumping at you. You know? Their happiness like lifts you up. You're connected to it. You're suddenly not struggling with the world. You're in harmony with the world. And apparently when this happens at a really visceral level, you feel that's nirvana. I know it's hard to believe. The world is such a motley place. People are so like this. Would it be good to be all connected to all of them? I don't even like being connected to myself. I'm constantly stubbing my toe. You know, pinching my finger in the door, like losing something. You know, like, where is it? Where is it? You know? So imagine being connected to everybody else losing everything. But actually, somehow, I guess it multiplies beyond bearability and somehow it then all becomes funny or something. I don't know. I can't explain it. I really can't explain it. But this is the Buddha point is this is the Buddha's discovery is what I'm saying. Emptiness of the self, meaning emptiness of that falsely congested absolute me that's in there, you know. And if you don't think you have it in there, what you're supposed to do, they say, the Tibetans brilliantly say this, they say, just remember a time when you felt righteously indignant, when you were falsely accused, when someone comes and says, you did this and this and this, and you didn't. You know, yeah, like usually a family member when they come, they say, you took my cheese. Isn't there a book like that? You took my cheese. And then you go, I did not. And the I comes out like, whoo, like this. And if it's too heinous what they've accused you of, you can't even speak. It's like you feel choked from the diaphragm to the throat. Because this solid thing comes up that's you, that's innocent, that's pure, and it totally asserts itself, and it chokes the life from you. Actually, in a way, your relative life gets choked because this absolute thing is there that nobody's appreciating. In fact, they're disappreciating it. And then, you know, more tragically, but that's when you can really notice how absolute you feel. When you get really angry, of course, is when you act absolute. And that's why when people get really angry, when they have that absolutist misknowledge about the status of the self, thinking that that they're so real, that then they will harm those they love. They will destroy themselves. They will wreck their own cars, which for Americans is almost worse than death. They will do all these terrible things because the anger takes a hold of something that's absolute. That is to say, it's unrelated. It's unrelated to the face that they punch. It's unrelated to the head that they bang on the wall. It's unrelated to the car that they drive furiously into the bumper of the other car. Do you know what I mean? Because the absolute doesn't mind banging into things. So this distortion of the human being, misplaced absolutism about the self, is the cause, the second noble truth. And we free of that second noble truth, we experience nirvana, which is the prognosis of the human condition, meaning freedom from suffering, true happiness. And then the fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path of correcting our intellectual misunderstanding of the world, not just meditating. I hope, Amanda, you don't think it's just meditating. That's not Buddhism. Because you can meditate on the wrong things and you can get like more ignorant. You know, people can meditate on hatred and they can decide to go out and attack Iraq rather than become enlightened. You know, they can meditate on how great they are. I know a lot of Buddhist teachers actually who didn't quite understand Buddhism, but who are supposedly Buddhist teachers, who meditated for years without dislodging the deeper feeling of I'm the one. And after 20 years of deep meditation, what did they do? They jumped up off their pillow and they said, Eureka, I'm the one. I want a Cadillac or a BMW or like some disciples. In other words, more egotistical than before. Buddhism is, first it's an intellectual correction. The first branch of the Noble Path is called realistic view, worldview. It's correcting a misunderstanding of the world. And that is done by understanding, not by anything else. Then once you correct a misunderstanding on a cognitive level, on an intellectual level,
it won't necessarily immediately change the visceral level, the gut level where you're still you're still the absolute. And then that's where meditation comes in. You take that intellectual understanding that you have, that you know that you're not the absolute, you're only relational, and you press that against your instinct that you're the absolute, and then eventually the Buddhist psychological tradition tells us, scientific tradition tells us, you can transform your instincts. Because what the human being is, the greatness of the human being, is that the human being is a completely soft-programmed being. There is no hard wiring in a human being. A human being can become a mass murderer, who is a perfectly nice person around the house, who wouldn't be nasty to granny. Later on, they can become a mass murderer. And actually, a mass murderer can become a saint. In fact, there are several, many in Buddhist history, great killers who became enlightened, actually, and became deeply repentant, and who became lifesavers subsequently, which is why Buddhism is very against capital punishment. They're not necessarily against self-defense sometimes, because if a mass murderer is about to murder you, then it's bad for them even to get one more murder racked up into their karma. Not to mention it's bad for you, losing your precious human life endowed with liberty and opportunity and intelligence to become enlightened. So you might defend yourself, but once someone's in your power, like a criminal in a prison, to then kill them out of vindictiveness, out of feeling that they are impossible to rehabilitate, that they cannot be retrained, that they cannot come to a new understanding, this is considered barbarous in Buddhist societies for 2,000 years. Not that they were all perfect and didn't still do it, some of them, but they were against capital punishment thousands of years ago, in fact, which is a sad commentary on much of our country today, I'm afraid. Okay, so did you get basic Buddhism now? That's it. Is everybody clear? Therefore, after that, all Buddhism is, the whole of it, intellectual, sort of meditational and religious, and ethical and social, is a process of re-educating the human being to diminish the exaggeration of the self-absoluteness and to realize the relativity of the self. Not to realize the non-existence, but the relativity. The non-existence of an absolute self, which is the releasing of the existence of a relative self. Is that clear? I hope so. My quiz to all of you, so that you can remember that simple thing, because that is what Buddhism is. So all of the institutions of Buddhism, the entire Buddhist movement throughout history, in Asia and even now in the West, it is not a religious movement to convert people. It is not a thing to enroll people in membership institutions. It is not necessarily some rituals and some this and that, although all those kind of things do take place because human beings do them. And so therefore this educational system will employ whatever beings do and turn it around to teaching this basic lesson, which is the lesson that if you can slowly diminish the sense of self-absolutization, and you can come to a more relational way of being, and the more you do, the more happy you will be. And I like to say, like a being who realizes their absolute selflessness, which means their relative self, is a being who is like someone who has taken a cork out of the center of their circulatory system, a kind of clog, They have used an intellectual, meditational, and ethical roto-rooter to get rid of a terrible congestion at the core of their being, which is them trying to be absolute in a relational world and them trying to impose themselves as an absolute on that relational world. Now, some religions and some psychologies, go part way with that. And they go into saying, well, yeah, you yourself are nothing. But, there's a God who is an absolute self. And then they tell you to do all these kind of self-centered things in the name of that. And that's a very unfortunate misunderstanding. To re-reify that ego, reproject that absolute ego onto some sort of divine ego. And unfortunately, that does happen in some more tribal type of religions. A person can say, oh, I'm so humble, or I'm nothing in the light of the divine. Oh, the divine is everything. The divine is Descartes, who is really real. He's the real one, or she's the real one. Oh, and so I'm nothing, I'm so humble. Oh, but now the divine tells me to go out and kill the unbeliever. Okay, I'm going to go do it. And then they behave just as selfishly and as destructively and absolutistically as before. So this is not just a belief in something. It is not a projection of something elsewhere. It is a critique of the false absolutization of self or anything else that releases beings to really have their fully relational existence and really realize in an evolutionary way the full potential of their relational existence, which is infinite, actually, because there's no end to it. You think you're going to just die and get out of all of this? No way. There's no death in the sense of a final destination. There's no final sleep. You think, as Hamlet said, I mean, Shakespeare said it doesn't take Buddhism, right? To sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub, right? For in that sleep of death, when we have shuffled off, what is it? What dreams may come must give us pause. So, okay, does everybody understand Buddhism? In addition to Amanda. Was that okay, Amanda? Thank you, okay. So now once you understand that this is movement in history, that is this educational process, then you see the Buddha's life as a symbol of this. The Buddha was raised to be a general, a conqueror of people. Now the person who feels they're absolute, this is a normal thing to do. What is it? You're the absolute, the world is not agreeing with you, so what do you conquer the world and make them agree with you? Right? That's what you're driven to do. Being a king, therefore, or a general, having an army, is a good thing. And then you can project yourself, that ego of yours, into a nation, and then you have allies. You go and you conquer others, right? That's the way. So that's one mode of society. Many societies have been societies built on feeling that it's inevitable that human beings always want to conquer other human beings. So the path of other conquest is one path, and that is the path of militarism. And actually, militarism became universalized, interestingly, about 2,000-3,000 years ago, around the time that Buddhism and other great world religions were founded and urbanization occurred, because it became possible for people to sort of, instrumentalize the conquest of others by having cities and specialization and agricultural surpluses so they can have professional armies and go and have empires and so on, which has led to now the whole superpower, fantasy of the moment. So it's a progression for 3,000 years. You can see it. It's the conquest of others' path, and its major institution is the militaristic state. On the other side, what is there on the other side? I mean, some of us today, in the Rambo world of America, or the W world of America, the Rumsfeld world of America, we might think that that is the only way that we're taught, actually, a history that that's the only way that beings have ever lived. But that is wrong. And Buddha's life is a symbol of that. Buddha rejected that life of other conquest, and he got into self-conquest. He got into the enterprise of conquering the misknowledge that drives the falsely absolutized self into a endlessly frustrating and ultimately failing mode of trying to conquer the outside, And he turned his energy into conquering the inside, to learn to control himself, not to control others. And that institution that he founded is called the monastic institution. The monastic sangha. It doesn't mean that everybody's a monk in it, but it means that the society creates a space in its center where those who become really determined to control themselves, to transform themselves from misknowing, sleepwalking, self-aggrandizing, self-centered beings into selfless, awakened, open beings, interconnected, compassionate beings. They make that their full life's work. They want to be total lifelong education in that work. And to nurture them, a monastic situation is created because they're not interested in property, they're not interested in progeny, they're not interested in status, they're not interested in clothes, they just wear a sack, they shave their heads, and they're like soldiers actually, but the war there is the war against the inner enemy of misknowledge and its attendant greed and hatred, fear and attachment. Do you follow me? So you get these two movements in history, the self-conquering movement and institution, the other conquering movement and institution, and you can see in history a seesaw between these two. Whenever a country becomes seriously educational, as I put it, I call it, I use a term that we don't even have in our language. We don't use this term, because we have a very instrumental notion about the value of education. Unfortunately, even though we have something called liberal arts, actually, liberal arts, sadly, really means for the liberal classes, which are the upper classes originally. But I like to take it as being liberating, and then that we can make something out of it. But we don't know that. In such a society, therefore, in societies that began to be infected by this counter-militaristic movement, the monastic self-conquering movement, education became the prime purpose of human life. I always tell my students, and so I'll tell you, all unasked, that you think you learn something to go do something with it. So therefore, it's sort of an instrumental thing. You read some literature to sort of be able to go to the cocktail parties between business deals. You learn art appreciation, whatever. You're not really trying to change yourself, just learning something. The real things you learn are your economics, your science, your sociology, so you can make money, you can be a professional, you can be productive in an industrial society. And that's what you're allowed to have the education to do. That's what you're supposed to do. And so then when you're conditioned to that, you think, I want to get out of here as quick as possible so I can get out and make some money. And you think, this is an ivory tower, this is not real life, this is not the real world. I'm just here to prepare for the real world, the real life, aren't you? That's how I was in education. I was like rushing to get out. Don't rush. What you're doing when you study, when you're being educated, is the purpose of your life. Learning is what the human being is most adapted to. And there's no limit to what the human being can learn. Any animal, but the humans have come to a peak, evolutionary peak, because that's what this brain is. You know that those neuroscientists, they think we only use 7% of our brain or 11% or something. They think the human brain is just hopelessly redundant. And you'll all be happy to hear here in Vermont that it's a more sane state, that they think female brains are more redundant than male ones. I love that one. That's wrong. Yes, maybe the brain is redundant if the purpose of life is driving on the freeway. Just steering like a beetle, just steering and going left, right. Up, down. If that's the purpose of life. But if the purpose of life is to understand the universe, there's nothing redundant about the brain. The brain is adequately suited to understanding the universe and the self. And it gives the mind a vehicle, to the spirit and mind a vehicle to really come to control, to understand, to master the relationality of being alive in such a way as to make yourself and others happy. You have to make others happy. Compassion is not a luxury. It's not a nice thing you decide. Compassion becomes a necessity when you feel connected to others who suffer. It's like when my hand is on a fire, it's not a question, shall I get it off the fire? It hurts. I get it off the fire because I feel the hurt. You become truly compassionate. You feel the hurt of others. You get them out of the fire without asking, without feeling you're doing something special. Do you know what I'm saying? So, I don't know, I forgot what I'm doing now. So, history. So as those societies became more monastic, and more, that means more and more generosity. You know what the basis of the monastery is? In a Protestantly, culturally dominated society like America, we don't know. We lost that. The basis of this monastic institution, which is the core of the selflessness or the non-egocentrist education movement, is a free lunch. Buddha was clever. He didn't ask for breakfast. He didn't ask for supper. He only asked for lunch. He wanted it before noon. And he didn't want a big lunch. And also, you couldn't take tomorrow's lunch at one gulp. You had to come back tomorrow. And that's all he asked. Free lunch and some space. And exemption from social duty. That's hard to get from social authorities, believe me. Like our culture, what is the slogan of our culture? No free lunch. Isn't it? It shows how benighted we have become. So free lunch is the basis of this institution. And that means a certain generosity in the community. That they say, a person who wants to develop their own individual potential, their own freedom from suffering, to the evolutionary maximum capable for a human being, is deserving of my support. That even if they do nothing productive for me. Do you follow me? And that's why also partly, because India was more wealthy in that ancient time, India could support that. We were the poor. Europeans were the poor place in ancient time. They were running around with tin mines, little tin cup culture, painted blue, being picked, fighting the Romans. India, they had pearls and jewels and mangoes and much more agricultural production, like 15 times bigger than the Nile. They had wealth. Why Columbus was going there. You don't think it was just to practice yoga. No way. Because they were richer. So they could support more free lunch. In a sense, it's not just something about them intrinsically, it's the environment. So then this goes down in history. Then India becomes a much more gentle country. from a very fierce country that's very warlike, that defeated Alexander the Great, they became peaceful over the centuries. They abolished capital punishment pretty much. They became vegetarian, largest vegetarian country in the world, still today. Hinduism, instead of being Vedic sacrifice, animal sacrifice, it was the Vedas became like gentle, and they wouldn't dream of killing a cow. The Vedas, they're like munching on the cow and the burgers. The older Vedas are pure barbecue rituals. But then Hinduism became much more gentle, and India became more gentle, and then vulnerable to invasion, of course. So we lost track of that. We didn't realize what was the glory of India of the first millennium of the Common Era, when the great Buddhist universities were core institutions there. And they've even forgotten the Indians pretty much about that. And the people came from all over the world to Nalanda University. 40,000 students, lay people and monastics, supported by generations of kings, and flocked to by many intellectuals from China and Japan and Korea and Malaysia and Indonesia and everywhere. So that goes on in 1,000 years. And then it's sort of, unfortunately, India becomes vulnerable. They fall under the wave of the Persian, Iranian, Turkish invasions. They go into second millennium, first conquest by the Turkish and the Persians and the Tajiks, and then conquest by the Europeans. And they've only started to arise from that in the last 50 years. So that's India. But luckily, at the end of that period, before that was over, this whole culture, and then of course it spread elsewhere, China, Japan, and it made it more peaceful, these other countries. But the further away it was from its original matrix, the less powerful its impact on the society. In Japan, the state kind of always kept it under control pretty much. In China, it went on a separate track from the sort of state and its military organization, and it would get more powerful and weaken that, but then they would come and confiscate the property of the monasteries and cut it back every 3 or 4 generations. So it always remained an alternative world, a countercultural movement in all those countries. But in one country where it went, which when it went there was an extremely violent country, just like America today, was Tibet. Tibet was not a cute country with everybody going mani padme hum and making mandalas and nice monks. They were fierce conquerors in the 7th century, the time of Charlemagne. They were feared by the Chinese. They were feared by the Nepalis, the Indians, the Bengalis, even the Central Asians, the Persians, and the Silk Route. They conquered the Silk Route city-states for a century or more and sucked the wealth out of them. They were known as very crude and violent and frightening, the Tibetans, because they're so tough living at that high altitude. You get a particularly strong person, like Mongolians 5 centuries later. And so, but then the Tibetans got tired of being toughies. It's boring. It's no fun to clank around in armor and be Rambo and everything. It really isn't. And you don't have any fun. And you end up beating your wife and your girlfriend, and then nobody's happy. And so you become gentle because that's a better way to be, and you get tired of conquering. And so then the Tibetans got into Buddhism because everybody around them was into Buddhism, the Silk Route states, the Chinese and the Indians, and so the Nepalis. And so they started getting like that. And in 1,000 years, from 600 or 640 to 1640, over that period, basically the Tibetans became this incredibly gentle, relatively demilitarized, in fact, almost completely demilitarized society. So they took the institution of self-conquest to a very extreme social form that has not happened really anywhere else on the planet, although they shared that social form with the Mongolians from about the 15th, 16th century. And then the Mongolians, and remember, who are the Mongolians? Genghis Khan, they conquered the world. Their empire was larger than the British Empire. And they, in 2 or 3 centuries, they're like, oh, mani padme hum, and where's the incense, and I'm going to meditate and be Buddha, and whatever, And then, of course, in the 20th century, chewed up by all the imperialists, the Chinese imperialists, the British imperialists, the Russian imperialists, because you become vulnerable, just like the Indians had happened to them 1,000 years earlier. So this is just the history of this, I'm saying. Then what happened at a very interesting time, at the same time that Tibet came to its full form of its nonviolent society, its monasticized society, 17th century. West is beginning its modernity under the basis of the Protestant ethic, under the direction of Max Weber, I guess. He's retroactively guiding them on how to secularize and industrialize. And unfortunately, with the destruction of Northern European monasticism, what happens to Northern Europe? In this seesaw, that drama that I'm trying to share with you, of militarism versus monasticism. When they demonasticize, what institutions start to take over everything? Militarism. And what happens? People swarm out of Europe. They conquer the Americas. They conquer Africa. They conquer Asia. You have imperialism. Modernity means imperialism, unfortunately. Secularization means the conquest of the world, the genocide of the Native Americans, the genocide of Africans, right? The founding of our country, unfortunately, sadly, of our current America. We have a myth of ourselves, and we have a dream of ourselves as the dissenters from empire, as the rebels against empire. And that is very precious, and we should nurture that. That's the true source of anything good about us as a country, our pluralism and our rebellion against empire. But unfortunately, we're still very co-opted into empire, aren't we, today? What are we doing today? What is the doctrine, the Cheney doctrine, or they call it the Bush doctrine now, but it was really written by Cheney. The doctrine of preemptive strike, of being sole superpower. This is a ridiculous form of utterly ineffective and impractical attempt at a new imperialism, of world domination. There's a great article in New Yorker a couple of weeks ago, which I thought I loved, where in future Miss America contests, he says that, the girls in Miss America, they say, well, now, what do you want, Charlene? And then she used to say, well, I want everyone to be happy and I want world peace. And now what they're going to say is, well, I want everybody to be happy and I want eternal American domination over the world. That's what they're going to say. I want eternal domination of America over the whole world. That's what they're going to say in beauty contests. It is funny, But it's a tragic, because this, especially today, because weapons of mass destruction give terrorists equal ability to nations, really. They can do, there is no fighting other nations anymore. There's fighting alienation in any individual that is so great that they are willing to die to kill you. No one should be allowed to reach such a state of life anymore. It's impossible. Therefore, absolute destitution is not allowed to be perpetrated on people. Refugee camps are not allowed to leave people in them for decades and generations and generations. Wealth has to be shared. Land has to be fairly shared. No more can we say we're going to shove these people, all of them, into prison. We're going to shove all of these people into some prison camp, and then we're going to enjoy it, and it'll be all right. It's impossible now, because those areas of despair will breed the destruction of there'll be no winner, in other words. It's impossible. So now we're in a very sorry path. Okay, Vermont, thank you. So now we're in a very very difficult situation. You see, I personally was very freaked out to come to this discovery, what I consider a discovery of the role of monasticism in world history. This doesn't matter, Buddhist or Christian or Taoist or Sufi or any kind of monasticism. It doesn't matter. There's actually a little tiny bit of Protestant monasticism left here and there, some Lutherans. But it doesn't matter. Any kind of monasticism means an institution where beings can turn their energies into a sort of self-transformation, self-conquest. And a society that nurtures that to any degree has at least some asylum from the universally, conformist pattern of that you must live to conquer others. That's what life is. Being productive is to dominate others in some way or another. You're going to win this game. You're going to be a lawyer and you're going to win the lawsuit. You're going to win the campaign. You're going to win the competition. You're going to win more money. You're going to beat out the competition. This is the conquest of others. And unfortunately, the root of that, all these other things seem more peaceful, but the root of that, of course, is the militaristic way of life. And we in America are totally addicted to the militaristic way of life. We have to face that fact if we're going to try to cure it. There's W didn't come from nowhere. He's just adding 50 billion of money that we don't have, to add more weird weapons that are not going to defend us against anything, but they're going to prolong the fantasy that we're powerful and we're immune to relationality with the world, which we're not. And actually, we already had the world immigrate here to wash our clothes and to clean the lawns and to do work that we were lazy to do. And therefore, they're all here. How can you use a missile defense against people who might be your butler, who might be making chapatis down in the basement of your building? You're going to blow yourself up. So a new approach. But now, the self-conquest institution has withered away. We don't understand it. We don't know what it is, even. And actually, we're told it's impossible. You're told by sociologists that you can't understand you're a product of your social conditioning, and you can't understand it. You're helpless. Marxist, You're helpless, programmed by your social status and your social position. And everything you do is just a mouthing off your social position. You can't understand it. By your psychologists, you're told your unconscious is like bubbling up here and there, and it's blipping off here and there. You'll never understand that either. You just have to talk to somebody for $100 an hour forever. And then maybe that, and then you talk it out, and then they'll tell you to stay cool. But you can't really control it. As Freud said, you just get rid of neurotic suffering and you get around to ordinary suffering. And then they've given that up because that doesn't work and it's too expensive. So then they say, well, you don't even have a mind. You're just some kind of wetware. You're like a brain with some things gurgling in there, some neurotransmitters gurgle around, And so we're going to give you some pills, and you just take a pill. And you won't understand how it's made, you don't understand what's gurgling, you don't understand the brain. You're like some person with some seaweed in your head running around, and you just keep dropping things in that you pay us handsomely for that. But you're helpless. They all tell you you're helpless. Even your religions tell you, oh, you're helpless, somebody else has to save you. And maybe it's nice if somebody else is nice. But unfortunately, they tend to tell you somebody else will save you no matter what you do as long as you have the right membership card. And that's really unfortunate. Because that leads to religious war and conquest and violence and torture of the unbeliever and this kind of thing. So here we have a tradition, an educational. Now in school, we don't tell you this. In school, we tell you that you can learn. Few of us tell you not only can you learn skills and can you learn more information, we also tell you can actually become more intelligent. You can actually increase your intelligence. And we say you can learn to be more emotionally intelligent. You can become more kind and more compassionate by reading world literature, by sharing the collective imagination of the world. You could even learn yoga and become more in control of your health. But we don't do that at our school because we think it might be religious. And so we think football isn't religious. Ha! Football is the religion of militarism, of course. It's nothing but lacrosse and football, those are military games. Yoga is the self-control, self-conquest type of tradition, the little bit that's left, But we don't understand this in terms of, lifelong thing. And when people say, well, Buddhism is so popular, people are interested in Buddhism, people like the Tibetans, what they're liking is that the Tibetans, although their country has been crushed, they are still in process of being genocided. And don't just blame the Chinese. The Chinese would not be doing it if they weren't being supported by the world corporations to do whatever they like. So after all, some backward people. The Tibetans are not important because they're not consumers of Coca-Cola. They don't buy Fords. They don't, they just run around with their yaks and they go, mani padme hum. The British even thought they didn't have wheels because they didn't have cars, but they have prayer wheels. They just prefer to use the wheels to pray with. Tibetans are very clever. They have 3,000 RPM prayers to gain good merit for their future lives. They're out there working it up. You see some Tibetan, they're typing, they're working, they're cooking, and they're praying. They have it going around. I'm telling you, when Tibet is free, I have a particular thing. I'll share it with you all because any Tibetans in Burlington want to do it. But I have a moral patent on it. I want to have the hubcap concession for Tibet. And I'm going to make Om Mani Padme Hum hubcaps. And then people are going to go cruising down the road, and there's going to be Om Mani Padme Hum, it's 4,000 RPM. Whoever patents the Om Mani Padme Hum hubcap is going to make a fortune. After the Mao hubcap has not been that useful. So this is the point where we're at, where we're trying to revive those of us. One sociologist said to me, the peace movement. Some Vermonters occasionally go to Washington and protest. You know, some people who have other jobs temporarily as amateurs, they go out and they say, this is too much, and they vote. But unfortunately, then they have to go back to their jobs, and then the war movement people go back to their jobs, and they make hundreds of thousands and billions of dollars. So there's no match. So the peace institution, from history we see it's the monastic institution. I was a monk. I'm not a monk anymore, by the way. The Dalai Lama always teases me. He says, I've never seen an ex-monk be so enthusiastic about monks, he said, which is very ironic, I have to admit. You know, I'm not a monk, and I'm not going to be a monk again, because in Buddhism you can only do it once, in Tibetan Buddhism. And if you fail in one life, then you have to wait another life. But you know, I came to a sociological and historical understanding of the value and the power of that institution. So anyway, this is where we've come down to, and this is where we have the destroyed Tibet, which actually represents the educational, is the kernel of the educational tradition, not religious, but educational tradition that is sorely needed in a planet that is threatened by a universal militarization, by a self-destructive, lemming-like universal militarization that we are the leaders of, unfortunately. Our country, that is to say. Not we personally, but our country. And then we have America that is in the grip of the opposite, this militarization. And therefore we like those people who were destroyed, and we feel something from them. There's some level of self-control there. There's some level of orientation toward evolutionary development that we feel despaired and hopeless about, because we are told that there's nothing we can do about anything. They tell us that also politically, by the way, that there's nothing we can do, because they don't want you furry-feeted, hobbit, liberal Vermont people to vote. So they want you to think that your vote is meaningless and won't do anything. And therefore they get the voting percentage down to 40%, and then therefore they can win with 20% of fanatics. If 75% of the people voted, in Europe, you know, my wife is Swedish, in Europe, 95% of the people vote, because why? They had World War on their soil. Actually, the Swedes didn't, but it was near enough. They had the war right there on their soil. So they know how bad it can get. We don't. We are all shocked somebody blows up a building. So we think that's a big shock. They had the whole cities turned to rubble themselves. So therefore they vote because they know that you let really bad people get in there who have bad habits and who have confused ideas, and it can get really bad. Even you have on paper all kinds of wonderful democratic and liberal ideas, it can go truly bad. Okay, so now I come to His Holiness's ethic for the new millennium. I think I'm probably late, but quickly. And in this, I just want to make some points. His main point in that is that, one of his main points philosophically is that the human being, and this is a very Buddhist idea, the human being's basic nature is compassionate. Now that doesn't mean the absolute nature. And that doesn't mean that the human being can't be more destructive, actually, if they are trained that way, if they get habituated that way, than other animals who may be less compassionate naturally, right? Human being is capable of the greatest evil as well as the greatest good because of the cleverness, you know, and the fact that they share knowledge. We have speech. Through speech, we have a collective mind, through history and through space. And we can learn from each other, so we have a much larger, even than our own brain. We have a group brain that can think through all kinds of amazing things. And therefore destructive things too, you know, as well as creative things. But our nature is compassionate. The Buddhist view of evolution is that we got to be humans, we who were personally other animals, by developing more compassion, by developing more sensitivity. We're mammals. Mammals know, especially the more wise ones, the female ones, they know that the boundary of self and other is only relative. The female bears the young inside her own body. You know, normally you don't want somebody even stepping on your toe. Imagine saying, oh, okay, live in my body for 10 months, 9 months. Oh, sure. I thought men are not capable of that. They don't even understand that. That's such a far out thing. You know? It's amazing. This little parasite comes in there, and then pretty soon it's out there playing soccer. You know, after big labor of carrying it around for a while. You know, but that's a mammal. So therefore, that's a deep visceral lesson that self and other boundary, you know, is, and that there can be identification with others. And even falling in love is a lesson in enlightenment. When you fall in love with another for the short time that you're just in love, you forget yourself and you absolutize them and you identify with them. And their happiness is all there is in your life, temporarily. And luckily, if you're lucky and they have the same way about you, it's really harmonious, it's a symphony. And then, of course, what happens is each one thinks, wait a minute, Do they love me as much as I love them? And that's the end of it. And then you're back into your individual envelope and you're back into your unsatisfactory struggle. But the fact that you have the capability to do it is the human nature. You know, no human being who is not held as a child. Some people complain about their mothers and their fathers, but actually no human being who is not held and stroked in their first year of life has a well-developed brain. They get all messed up unless they're actually held, because we communicate in that way. We are creatures, therefore, of great compassion. Human beings have infinite compassion ability. And that's His Holiness's first point. Therefore, to live in an uncompassionate way is anti-human, is against our nature. And therefore, he always says, when people ask him what is his religion, he says, my religion is the common human religion of kindness, of love and kindness. That is the human religion, he said. And all the others are built upon that, this prophet, that history, this text, that scripture, but they all really are aiming for kindness. And any interpretation of any of them that is into violence or into not kindness is mistaken. And short-lived, actually, usually, in history, fortunately. So those are the common human religion is love and kindness, based on the actual biology of human nature. And then 2, that spirituality is more broad than any particular form of religiosity. He discourages the agenda of making anyone become a Buddhist and condemns all religious institutional competition. He is always proclaiming, don't be a Buddhist. Even in Austria this time, although most of the 10,000 people there were Buddhists, he was saying, in case there had wandered in a couple of secularists or humanists or Christians or Jews, he would say, or Muslims, he was saying, I don't want you to be Buddhist. It's fine, you can be here, but don't be Buddhist. If you learn something, you can meditate about compassion, about yourself, about your ego structure, fine, learn it, but you don't have to become Buddhist. That's not the point. Because we don't want a bunch of egotistical Buddhists. We want selfless people, whatever they call themselves. And he challenges the other leaders of world religions that in this 21st century, at this end of history, don't start competing for market share. Don't start trying to convert everybody else. It will lead to violence and conflict. But I don't think they're listening, very many of them. So he says, therefore, spirituality is essential for individual happiness and for keeping the world livable. But he considers humanism to be a very important form of spirituality. He doesn't require it to have religious, theistic or non-theistic elements. 3, he says that ethics also are more universal than specific religious prescriptions. And I quote here, he says, religious belief is no guarantee of moral integrity. Looking at the history of our species, we see that among the major troublemakers, those who visited violence, brutality, and destruction on their fellow human beings, there have been many who professed religious faith, often loudly. Religion can help us to establish basic ethical principles, yet we can still talk about ethics and morality without having recourse to religion. That's just a quote from him. 4, that nonviolence is essential to solving the man-made disasters of conflict and wars. And 5, that idealism is not as unrealistic as modern, cynical, secular theories of psyche and society have made it out to be. Now, these are sort of his usual themes that are in that book, Ethics for the New Millennium, as well. But his new themes that he puts in there that I had not seen before, and this, by the way, is one of the things that I find praiseworthy from my personal perspective in His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. I've known him for almost 40 years. And I have seen him grow and change, definitely. He was not always as amazing as he is now. He was always cute. He was always a cute Dalai Lama. The Tibetans always loved him, and they think he's, the Messiah returned. But he had, he couldn't answer certain questions, and he would think about this, and he had a little bit of a nervous laugh, and this and that when he was younger. He's changed, all for the better that I've seen. And one thing is, I've seen him give similar talks, and I've, sort of the stump speech. I've seen it 1,000 times, and yet I always learn something new. It's never the same thing. He brings in something he read in a science magazine. He brings in something new he's thought. He thinks it through again as he talks about it, so that you learn it again with him. And it's always that case. And so this book, for example, has those usual themes, but then it has new ones. And the one that I really was proud of him was that he comes up with the strongest critique yet, a kind of prophetic critique of materialism and excessive seeking of wealth. And he says that he used to, coming from Tibet, which was sort of, materialistically backward, he used to kind of romanticize the developed countries, the industrial developed world. And he used to think that those countries, by the use of machinery and technology, diminished the amount of human suffering and give human beings the ability to then concentrate on some other things and perhaps develop themselves spiritually. He had that kind of that fantasy when he was, admiring the car, admiring the airplane. How it is. But he said that he's kindly come to decide. I'll read his quote. He says, although I never imagined that material wealth alone could ever overcome suffering, still, looking towards the developed world from Tibet, a country then, as now, very poor in this material respect, I must admit that I thought it must go further toward doing so than is the case. I expected that with physical suffering much reduced, as it is for the majority living in the industrially developed countries, happiness would be much easier to achieve. The extraordinary advancements of science and technology have achieved, then I skip and then I say, but what I have discovered is that the extraordinary advancements of science and technology have achieved little more than linear numerical improvement. Progress has meant hardly more than greater numbers of opulent houses in more cities with more cars driving between them. Certainly there has been a reduction in some types of suffering, including certain illnesses, and yet there has been an increase in other types of suffering. I feel now that there has been no overall reduction. In other words, this whole industrial experiment, including with all of the destruction, pollution of the environment, destruction of the ozone layer, destruction of resources, exacerbating of the gap between rich and poor, and increasing the power of weapons of mass destruction and military destruction, it actually could be seen as actually something negative rather than some marvelous progress. He doesn't actually go that far. So that's the first point. He comes with a critique of materialism that I think is very important, actually, but personally, especially for us, because we tend to take a false pride in that, when actually it has a destructive side to it. Second, he issues a passionate call for a spiritual revolution and also an ethical revolution. This from a leader of a people that have suffered as much as any in this terrible past century of genocide and mass destruction. Third, he argues adamantly, and here I'm proud of him again because he's always hoping that some of these big militarized governments will take pity on the Tibetans and do something. It's his job to be the spokesman for the Tibetans who are being genocided today. I want to repeat again and again. Their culture is being destroyed as we speak by Chinese policy, not by inadvertence. Like, they're doing what we Euro-Americans did to the American West. They're doing that now to Tibet as we speak. We must be aware of that. We must face that. And condoned in doing so, unfortunately, by the elites of the other countries, the corporate elites and the government elites of the other countries. Not by the people. There's tremendous sympathy in the world's population for the Tibetans and for this terrible tragedy of Tibet. But that sympathy is not reflected because democracies are not happening when you have militarism, even though they're on paper. So therefore, since he hopes for help from these governments, it's brave of him to step forward and argue adamantly for universal disarmament, sketching a series of systematic steps toward the total prevention of wars and war industries, likening war to a bonfire on which people are heaped like logs, and poignantly recalling his own personal visits to Auschwitz and Hiroshima. Fourth, he engages in a courageous critique of excessively luxurious living and over-concentration of wealth, and makes a clear appeal for altruism and universal responsibility in policy, based on his well-argued insight that altruism is the essential key to individual happiness and also social harmony. He is practical and optimistic about globalization, but not the imbalanced globalization currently going on that makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. And finally, he calls forcefully upon religions to focus on personal practice over institutional aggrandizement, tolerant pluralism over bigoted exclusivism. He insists on the priority of spirituality and ethics in personal practice over doctrinal purity and ritual formalism. In fact, he shows a willingness to dispense with institutional religion altogether if it only adds to the burdens people struggle with. Of course, he acknowledges the benefits of religion sincerely applied and makes an ingenious suggestion about overcoming the paradox of singularity in personal faith and pluralism in social practice. So that's sort of it. And the last thing I think that's amazing about that book, Ethics for the New Millennium, is that in the whole thing, in that whole book, he never gets into really the Tibetan plight and situation. In other words, he doesn't use his general approach to ethics, his sort of attempt to apply Buddhist ethics to the contemporary world situation in what he thinks of as a practical and realistic and necessary way. He never deviates in that book from making a general case to plead his personal case, that is his heart's agony, which is the suffering of his own people. He has other books about that. He makes a lot of speeches about that. But in this book, which he's addressing that topic of world religious ethics, he shows his tolerance and his wish even to dialogue with the Chinese oppressor, and he doesn't just grind them into, he doesn't pick out, in other words, on their misdeeds, which I think is a marvelous example of, putting your own problem behind you, and thinking about others' problems instead of shoving yours in their face. And the last thing I want to show is something, nothing to do with it. I just want to show this. I should have a slide. But this is a chart that I got from something called the World Game Institute, a wonderful institution in the New York area. It's called What the World Wants. And each of these little squares is $1 billion. And there's 780 of these $1 billion. And that's the world military budget in a year or two ago. The world, immediate expenditure on military by poor countries like Africa and India and Pakistan and Brazil and so on. Okay? And over here, in these different boxes, there are eliminate starvation and malnutrition, 19 billion. Provide shelter, 21 billion. Remove landmines, 4 billion. Build democracy, 3 billion. Eliminate nuclear weapons, 7 billion. Refugee relief, 5 billion. Stop deforestation, 7 billion. Prevent global warming, 8 billion. Prevent acid rain, 8 billion. Stop ozone depletion, 5 billion. Retire developing nations' debt, 30 billion. Provide clean, safe energy, 33 billion. Renewable energy, 17 billion. Prevent soil erosion, 24 billion. Stabilize population, 10.5 billion. Provide health care and AIDS control, 21 billion. Total, she doesn't have a total, and I don't even know where these figures come from, but you can just see it visually. It's like 1/4 of the ongoing military budget that has just been going up. It's just being sent up by the current group. And so it couldn't be more graphic. What devoting the entire social energy of a quote-unquote civilization to conquest of others, from the local economic level, from sibling competition in a family, from sports competition in a school, to military competition internationally. It leads to that. It leads to that. It's very tragic. So if they do what they should, if Jiang Zemin and George W. down there in Crawford, Texas, in between barbecues, if they decide that George is going to engage in dialogue with Saddam, that jackal, Saddam the jackal, they're going to engage in dialogue with Saddam, and they're going to cool their oil consumption, and Porgy is going to recognize global warming. And Jiang Zemin is going to decide to give Tibet back to the Tibetans, and he's going to get himself a Nobel Peace Prize. Of course, then the Tibetans promise they'll join China, so it's a win-win for him. And the Tibetans would legally join China rather than just be grabbed and annexed and occupied. And then the Tibetans will be happy in their own country, and Jiang will get the Nobel Prize, and they'll put him up there as the three immortals, him and Mao and Deng. And he'll never get that from anything else than doing that. So let's pray at this time that these people's hearts will change and that they will relent from their senseless careers. And particularly, I don't want to go into a negative thing at the end, but making war on a nation that's at hand, that's handy, that Daddy already had one whooping, gave one whooping to, and go out and give him a more proper whooping to sort of keep up with Daddy. I mean, and by doing that, to incur the hatred of millions more individual beings, each of whom is much more dangerous than some jerky guy who lurks in a palace, running around probably, I'm sure all the women try to run away from him. Although sadly, I'm sure he tortures a few. But instead of that, let's try being positive. Let's try spreading the American dream. Let's hope that he realizes that what he enjoys is what other people enjoy. He didn't enjoy yet being bombed by laser-guided weapons. I think it never happened to him down there in Houston. And so he doesn't think that's fun. He likes, barbecues. He likes a little sniff here and there. He likes a little drink here and there. He's sort of sworn off it. Maybe that's why he's so uptight. But the point is, let's see that his heart could relent. He could decide to fire Wolfowitz, Abrams, Pearl, Rumsfeld, and maybe keep a few of the others, and get a few peaceful people in there. Maybe he could do that. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's not beyond the Yaley to think of that. Skull and crossbones member. So, I hope that you have had. You better know what Buddhism is now. And then, as far as the Dalai Lama's thing, I recommend you read the Ethics for the New Millennium book, and I recommend that you start thinking that idealism is realistic. And so-called realism and realpolitik is in fact fantasy in this 21st century. Because we really must not have another century like the last century, because the weapons are much too powerful. They really, the book of Revelation of John, in the Christian Bible, has all these angels pouring out these vials of chemical warfare and biological warfare and nuclear radioactivity, and basically he foresees all of that, and that is potential there to happen. And it is happening actually already, in fact. But we can minimize it if we turn to the positive. The sort of sole superpower, supposedly, if it turned its power to empowering the world's individuals and creating peace instead of creating a condition of universal fear and war, will eventually mute and calm terrorism, because it will turn our energy toward fixing the refugee camps, educating the ignorant, protecting the women, protecting the environment. We have the power to do that, unprecedented in history. That's the unprecedented power we have. That stupid power about building some laser bombs and blowing up some adobe buildings and chasing some poor people in burnouses around with laser-guided weapons, that's not power, that's confusion. And we must not allow it to take place. You must elect Senator Jeffords and Senator Leahy. Thank you very much. Some of you have to go. I ran a little late, I know. I tend to do that. My son just rolls his eyes, and he says, there he goes. Can't turn him off, even when he has his laryngitis, practically. But on the other hand, if anybody wants to stay and ask some questions, please do.